You already know about me. I will not spend and waste time with say other things about myself. I will try to talk today about Romanian migration, which is a hard task because Romanian migration has already a history after 1989, and it's a complex history. This is the outline of the presentation. I think it is important for you if you want to really understand this migration, to have an idea about what happened before 1989. That's why I will start talking briefly about what happened 1989 when Romania was a communist country. Then just a few thoughts and words about the moment 1989, which means a lot for the Romanian international mobility. Then I will give you some figures about, and I will talk very briefly about the characteristics of Romanian migration today, just to have an idea about what we talk. And then the most of the presentation will be devoted to the history of this migration. We'll try to understand this history, talking about the phases of Romanian migration. And at the end, I will take the risk. Nobody do this in general, but I will take the risk to say a few words about the future of this migration, what I think about the future of this migration. So, as you probably all know, Romania was a communist country. Sorry, just a moment. Okay, a communist country, and in every communist country, probably, as you don't know, the authorities were obsessed with controlling the life of their citizens. This was happening not only in Romania, but in Romania during the last decades of the communism under the Ceausescu rules. This gone very far. One of the dimensions that was very important for the authorities was the mobility of the people, and international and internal mobility was strictly controlled. Basically, the people could not travel abroad without the approval of the authorities, and it was very hard to obtain this approval. If it is to put this in a, just a moment, what happens? It seems that this does not work. Okay. I wanted to show you in a different way how we can talk about the restriction, but it seems that something does not work. I will show you at the end. So there were only few forms of migration that were important in volume when we talk about international migration. And in fact, it is about two types. It is so-called ethnic return migration, a symbolic return to the mother country of the ethnics of different countries. It was migration based on selectivity on ethnicity. And in the communist Romania, there were three types of flows of ethnic return migration. We had migration to Israel, and you can see on the slides the figures about the volume of these migrations. The most important, not necessarily numerically, but as consequences for the current migration, was definitely the migration to the Federal Republic of Germany. And at the end of the communist period in the 80s, there were a few tens of thousands of Hungarian ethnics leaving Romania. You have to know that even those migrations were encouraged from destination, so they were stimulated by the destination states. They were also controlled by the communist authorities, and Romanian authorities allowed Jews for German ethnics to leave the country in exchange of very clear benefits, especially financial benefits. And this was the so-called selling of, especially in the case of German ethnics during the 70s and 80s, which was managed by the communist authorities under Ceausescu rule. Apart from this ethnic return migration, we can talk about forced migration. You can say that it was a consistent flow, but not so important as in the case of the other communist countries, because Romania don't have a common border with, and didn't have at that time, a common border with Western developed societies. So it was difficult to cross the communist border, and many people lost their lives or were jailed for attempts to crossing the border. So these were the two most important flows. What we had at the end of the communist time, a part of the poor country, was a country where there was a high pressure for international migration because the people couldn't even travel. There were only few models of international migration, and in fact, there was also a weak support for future development. And here I'm talking about migration networks, which could not develop. And even the small connections between Romanians and those living abroad were unevenly distributed across the country, because the most part of these connections were German ethnics or Jews, but they especially German ethnics were not spread all over the country, but they lived in specific historical regions in Transylvania and in Banat. In 1999, try again. This does not work. Sorry. So in 1999. The change of regime, I'm sure you know that the transition from communism to the liberal democracy and capitalism was not in Romania a peaceful one. It was in December 99, there was a revolution. And I just put on this slide one of the first decree that the new authorities adopted, because it referred to the passport liberalization, I said, so to the right of the people to have a passport. And this happens, the Romanian Revolution started in the second part of December, and you can see that in less than 1 month, one of the most important one of the decision taken was regarding this aspect of letting people traveling freely abroad. So this was the starting point, a high pressure for migration, not many Romanians abroad, and a poor country. What happened since then, it's that Romania evolved from almost closed country. You have to know that Romania was compared, especially under the Ceausescu rule, from this point of view, with Albania being considered one of the most closed communist country. So from one almost closed country, Romania evolved to be one of the main source country for intra-European migration on the east-west direction. I said one of the main because you already probably know how difficult it is to have very precise data in what regards migration, but maybe the most important source country for this migration. We talk about a complex and dynamic process of diversification, and we will have time to discuss about types of migration and destinations, or forms of migration and destinations. So these have changed during these 3 decades. And we will not have time to talk about this, but just to mention that international migration has a substantial effect in origin. And I would say it's an important topic in the public space. You will find migration in the press all the time. You will hear the politicians talking about migration, about the so-called diaspora. So one of the questions that was present obsessively in the public space was how many Romanians are abroad. And I have tried here on a few slides just to show you different estimations. Of course, during the time, the quality of the data sources about migration has improved. But now it's difficult to speak about the number of Romanians abroad with precision because, as you know, Romania is a new country and it's difficult to count when the people has the right to freely travel abroad. Which are the most recent estimation? We currently are talking about the population that is probably around 3.5 million. But this is important. It is important to mention that this represents a high percentage of the population of Romania. As you can see, it's more than 18%. It is also important to say that the population of Romania has decreased during the last decades, and it seems that international migration is one of the most important factor in this decrease. As you can see on the slide, it is estimated that 70% of this decline is due to international migration. Most of this migration happens in the European Union. So from the very beginning, or soon after the 1989, Romanian migration started to be oriented towards Europe, and this process is definitely connected with the Romanian accession to the European Union, and we'll have time to talk a bit about that. But in 2013, it can be estimated that about 75% of Romanians living abroad were in 5 European destinations and more. I can tell you that the more recent estimation for 2015-2016 concluded that about 3.1 million Romanians living in Europe. If you compare this with 3.5 million, then you can realize how important is Europe for Romanian migration. This means almost 90% of the Romanian migration in OECD countries. This is a conclusion from a recent OECD report. So it's a complex migration that it's mainly oriented towards Western European countries, EU countries. I have said that Romanian migration has already a complex history of migration, and researchers have tried to understand this history. And on this slide, I have listed different papers that try to tell the story of this migration using the idea of different phases. So there are periodizations periodizations different, but most of them agrees, let's say like this, on the most important phases. I will use the same idea of talking about Romanian migration in phases, and I will start here from the work of Dumitru Sandu, a work, the paper he published in 26, and that's because he used survey data in origin, which can give us somehow an image of the weight of each destination in the total number of departures for every country. So here I have tried to put it on another way than with words, this development. As you can see, we have 4 phases. I have used this color to suggest that Romanian migration has increased in intensity. I hope you notice that the color is increasing in intensity. And you see here the marks, these bars marks the end of different phases. You will notice, I'm definitely sure that they have different colors. It is because for this phase, the bar does not overlap with an event. So it's just something coming from the data, from the way Romanian migration evolved. The bars in red are in fact marking events related to the Romania accession to the EU, a process that had a huge impact on international migration. And this is the moment when Romanians, for Romanians, were lifted the visa restriction for Schengen space, and it has a great impact on migration to Schengen countries. This is the end of the preparation for accession. The 1st of January 2007, Romania became an EU member, and Romanians citizens become European citizens, having the right to travel freely in the European Union. But in the case of Romania, there were transitional arrangements when we will talk about this imposed, and this process of accession can be considered as finalized in 2014. Starting with the 1st of January, Romanians has also the work to the right to freely work in any European countries. In countries, yes, any EU countries, sorry. You also see here another type of bar. It is a dot line. It marks another type of event, let's say event that had a considerable impact on Romanian migration, and this is financial crisis, which affected some important destination of Romanian migration. But I would not consider for this phase this financial crisis or this end of transitional arrangements as marking new phases. It is rather marking changes inside the same phase. So maybe no, we decided that the questions will be at the end, but let me know if I go too fast. Okay, so let's start. The first phase of the Romanian migration was a phase that can be called an exploration. So I've already told you that the people were forced to stay in their country. They didn't have the experience of traveling abroad. They couldn't meet their friends or relatives abroad. They couldn't visit other countries. They couldn't work abroad. So it was a pressure for migration, in fact, for mobility. And during the first years after the 90, this was translated in a large diversity of the types of migration. And also during this phase, there was a relatively rapid change in the dominant type of migration. I have listed in the second part of the slides the most important types of migration and their most important destinations. One of the most important form of migration was ethnic return migration, was the end phase of this migration for Israel. You can see that the number of departure was relatively low, and practically this migration stopped a few years after 1990. And the population of Jews living today in Romania, it's very low. Migration to Germany was important in that period, and comparing with migration to Israel, you can realize this. They were the last years of this migration, and as I said, this was really important for setting up some networks, and especially for helping Romanian to easily enter the fortress Europe, because at that time, I remember Romania was the third country from the perspective of the European Union. And there was also the flow to Hungary, who continued. In this period, the number of departures and the migrants, in fact, to Hungary increased, but it was a migration that, in fact, had mixed characteristics of labor and ethnic migration. As I told you, there was a large diversity of forms of migration, and as you can see, Romanians continue to be among the asylum seekers in the Western Europe. And the excerpt from Dana Diminescu just stressed the idea that this was one of the few models, let's say, of doing migration that the Romanians were aware of. This stopped at the end of this period, as most of the destination countries changed their legislation, and it was not easy for Romanian to ask for protection. It was a phase when long-term migration was important, and many people left the country to move to USA, Austria, or Canada. And I think this is, in fact, really important. Labor migration started to develop, but as you can notice, the most important destinations were not towards the located in the west of the continent, but rather in the south, in the case of Turkey, or outside the European continent. This will change very soon. And during the second phase, in which we can say that in a way Romanian extended their exploration of the international space, the main characteristic was a change in the dominant type. So from the diversity of the first phase, we can now talk of the dominance of the labor migration. And it is also a change in the destination for the labor migration. If on the previous slide, Turkey and Israel were the main destination, now you can see that Italy took the lead. It was the country that attracted 22% of the departures estimated for this period of time. So it was already a movement from the south and southeast for the west of Europe. And you can notice here, Spain has already appeared with a low but still important percent of the departures during this period. And then we reach the third phase. This phase was started with an important event related to the process of Romania accession to the EU. It is about lifting Schengen visa restrictions for Romanians at the 1st of January 2002, an event that substantially reduced the international costs and risks associated with international migration. And this has, as a consequence, a substantial increase in the volume of migration, especially toward the Schengen countries. What happened then, it was that a Romanian could enter the Schengen space without a visa and could stay for 90 days in Schengen space. They, of course, didn't have the right to work, but this was enough to allow for the development of migration, especially towards Italy and Spain. And you can see here that the departures from Romania concentrated, the departures during this period concentrated towards Italy and Spain. Italy and Spain were countries are countries in the south of Europe, but they were at that time relatively new destinations for European migration with a large informal sector, and this allowed for the development of irregular migration. Of course, irregularity is a complex story. It was irregular, especially from the point of view of work. There were people who worked or doing jobs with requiring low qualifications, work onshore, many of them seasonal, many of them in the category of 3D, dirty, dangerous, difficult work that were not anymore taken by the native population. During this phase, Italy and Spain reached the threshold of more than 500,000 Romanians, and both migration were developed mainly on the base of the network, migration networks. And just to have an idea about what happened, then I will show you a few things about migration to Spain. I have chosen Spain because you already know my PhD thesis is about migration to Spain, but there is also another reason. Spain is using population register, and at least at that time stimulated irregular migrants register, and was successful to do this. Many of the Romanian migrants, even though they had an irregular status, were well aware of the advantages of registering and registered with this padrón municipal. This is the name of the register in Spanish. And you can see here the huge increase of this migration during this period. Basically, when starting, the Romanian migration was at a very low level. I can tell you there were only a few thousand Romanians, I think 2,000 in this moment. And only in a short period of time, they become, at the end of 2006, we'll see here the most important immigrant population in Spain. This migration has a long tradition in Spain, but I'm talking about Moroccans migration, but Romanians were able to become a more numerous migrant population than Moroccans. Just to show you how spread was this migration, this is the map of the community of Madrid. It's an administrative territorial unit that has the center in Madrid, the capital, the city of Spain. And you can see here that basically in 2004 already Romanians were almost everywhere. This was, of course, I have to mention that Madrid, like any capital city, is always the most important destination, or at least at the beginning of one migration. So that's why I have chosen this region. Just to give you a flavor about those times, this is what a priest that I interviewed in 2006, the way he talked about Romanian migration in Spain. So developing so quickly, Romanian migration gave the impression that the Romanians are everywhere. Even Romanians were talking about their connationals as being everywhere in Spain. But in what I said until now, I let you the impression that this was just influenced by the process of accession, the European Union, and that it was just needed to open the gates for Romanian migration, or to allow them to travel with a low cost, and migration would develop. And this is not entirely true. I have just added here a figure showing the evolution of the GDP as a percentage of the GDP from 1989. And you can see here what the profound crisis, or have a hint about what profound crisis Romania has experienced at the end of the 90s. So just to have an idea, using another indicator, you can see here that there was a huge decline in the number of employees. So in this period, because this is our phase, many people lost their jobs in factories or in other type of employment, and for them migration was not just a strategy of developing or trying something different. For many of them was a matter of survival. So you can have an idea about how this was possible. It was on one side the fact that the restrictions related to the entrance in the Schengen space were relaxed, but it was also about a very complex and deep crisis during the Romanian transition. And now I think we can start to talk about the last phase, the current phase that started in 2007. So in 2007, Romania became an EU country, and this had an impact on Romanian migration, because starting with this date, the Romanian citizens could freely travel in any EU country, including here the EU countries not members of the Schengen space at that time, meaning the UK and Ireland. And but they didn't have the right to work freely in many countries, because many, or the most important destinations for Romanian migration decided to introduce transitory arrangements, meaning that they didn't open the labor market for Romanian citizens. In the most cases, this ended in January 2014. And another event that affected the Romanian circulation or migration abroad during this phase was a global financial crisis that hit seriously the countries in the southern part of Europe, the economies of the countries in the southern part of Europe, especially Spain. What happened during this phase, it is that Romanian migration has concentrated once again towards the European Union. And we will see immediately there was we can talk about the reorientation of the labor migration from southern to central and northern countries of Europe. It seems that migration has increased at both ends of occupational hierarchy. During this phase, the specialists talk about the growth of the number of unskilled or low-skilled migrants, but also an increase in the number of highly skilled migrants. And what happens is that as a type or forms of migration, Romanian migration has diversified very much. We talk about out-migration, return migration, about seasonal migration, circular, We talk about the remigration, so people who return to Romania and then go back again abroad, and about people circulating even without returning to Romania between multiple destinations within the EU. I have tried here to represent the increase in the stocks of Romanians in different European countries. In fact, here are represented the most important destinations, those having more than 100,000 Romanian citizens in 2020. And you can see what happens. So this is the moment when Romania became an EU member. And in that year, in 2007, there is a huge increase in migration. This is Spain, this is Italy, in both countries. What happens, probably the Romanian accession to the EU has the effect of a regularization for many Romanians, so they could at that moment change their status from irregular to regular migrants. But this is not the entire story. Recent data, OECD data analyzed in the report that I previously mentioned, showed that this was also an effect of reuniting the families of the migrants. So there are many women and children in this increase. So it was like very fast regularization with the effects of the regularization that usually appear in time in this only 1 year. In 2007, 2008, when the financial crisis started, I have already mentioned it affected the economies of the Southern Europe, much more than the economies in the Central and Northern Europe. And Spain was hardly hit by the global financial crisis. And you can see here how the stock of Romanians in Spain has not increased in the previous way, but more it started to decrease at a certain point in time. You can see also that in Italy the increase is not so accelerated as in the previous year. And then we have 2014, when all the transitory arrangements were lifted, and you can see very clearly how migration to Germany that already started to increase in the afterwards of the financial crisis, and also migration to UK starts to develop. Under the estimation of the Eurostat, in this moment, probably Germany is the second destination for Romanian migration, as you can see here. The estimation for UK is for 2019, as the UK is not anymore a member of the European Union. As you can also see on the screen, Austria, France, and Belgium are the other 3 EU countries hosting more than 100,000 Romanian migrants. And now just a few words about the much discussed type or form of migration that was expected in this moment when the financial crisis started to, the effects of the global financial crisis started to become manifest in many destination countries. There were expectations that the Romanian will return to their origin country. The data about return migration are always really difficult to register, so take this as just an estimation, but as you can see, there, and this is confirmed by other sources as surveys in origin area, this didn't push Romanians to return to their origin country. What it is more interesting is that the number of returnees, which is not low, but again, we are talking about a substantial population living abroad. What you can see here is that a large proportion of these returnees are young migrants, so people that at any time can go abroad. That's why at the beginning I said that in this phase we can talk about the process of diversification, and we can talk of very different forms of migration. So the idea is that in the case of Romanian migration, especially this European migration, there are two important words to keep in mind is circulation. And I think the Romanian migration become very flexible and highly sensitive to the changes in the environment and able to answer to the smaller changes, moving towards another destination country or returning. And I think another word is transnational. Even though I didn't use it during this presentation, this is really important because the connection between the country of origin and the destination and among people living in different countries are important and are giving one of the most salient characteristics of this migration. About return, so if we expect an end of this migration, I would rather say no, and I don't think we can expect high levels of return in the classical use of this term, but as far as the Romanians will get older, probably this process of diversification will continue, and probably we will also have a retirement return. What else? I think that the complexity of effects of migration will continue to grow because there are effects that will continue to increase in magnitude. I think the effects on the labor market in Romania are really important, and I think that we expect new types of effects in the future, like the effects of migration on left behind elders, or returning migrants without a secured future in all the ages. So this was what I intended to say about Romanian migration. Now I would be very glad to hear your questions, comments,